Yes, we can see the screen. You can
Perfect.
just enlarge. Yeah, perfect.
So, like Talida talked about, like the wiser implementation of the experience well-being. What we'll now focus on for the coming 15 minutes is the work that we did on evaluative well-being, and specifically to build an harmonized panel data set of subjective well-being for European regions. When I talk about panel data here, it's a regional panel, so we try to track evaluative well-being in regions over time. And the whole idea of creating a regional panel was, and that being part of the Wiser project, basically started from the idea that, like in a lot of conversations that we have with regional governments, that they are in principle very interested in subjective well-being as an outcome measure, but that there's not always like data available to track progress in well-being within their own region. And since we also propose in the WISER project to have evaluative well-being as an outcome measure or as an headline indicator signifying the outcomes of a good life that you want to link to specific conditions for a good life, the idea was created to develop a regional panel for subjective well-being in European regions. Where we don't use new data. So that is like important to stress in this regard. We did not collect any new data on subjective well-being. We did not do survey research, but what we did, and that is in principle this project, it's a recycling project, and we recycle in essence like all data that is available on subjective well-being and then the evaluative well-being in European regions. Also like to incorporate this measure into possible dashboards for regional governments so that they are able to track subjective well-being within their regions over time. So like what is the need for these regional governments? They need to understand that the regional subjective well-being, they would like also what we got from talks with them to benchmark their region against other regions. And as I said, they want to track progress over time. You can say, well, you can use national data for that, but like in the conversations with regional governments, it was apparent that they rather have like data on their own region. Many still feel that their region is particular, although there are many similarities actually between regions within Europe. And at the same time, you can see here in this graph, and this is earlier research that we conducted in the beginning on the WISER project, where we linked subjective well-being using the Gallup World Poll to regional productivity, using total factor productivity at the regional level. You also see in the graph at the bottom left that there can still be considerable differences within countries. In some countries, there are more differences between regions in terms of subjective well-being than in other countries, but it's not that every country or region within a country has the same profile in terms of subjective well-being and also factors linked to that. So if we look at the present data on European regions, there's actually a lot of data out there on European subjective well-being. There are many different cross-national surveys that are conducted since like the 1970s that contain a subjective well-being question. But at the same time, you see that if you look at the regional observations, that most of these surveys are conducted to generate national representative data, and which are not necessarily representative for regions. So like in most of these surveys, 1,000 people in a specific country are surveyed, and then like in every region, you might have 50 to 200 participants, and that doesn't necessarily in a particular year gives a good overview of or thorough assessment of the average well-being within that region. We also see that there is that different surveys do slightly different instruments. Most surveys nowadays use a 1 to 10 scale, except for Eurobarometer and Latino Barometer, probably. So if you want to use different surveys in that sense, you are stuck with the problem still that question skills and also to some extent survey years do not always align. And what is missing, if there are panels available for regions, it focuses maybe mostly on country. It remains at the individual level. There are, of course, a couple of very good European surveys available that track individuals over time. And if there is regional data, it tends to pull several years together. So what we do in this data set, we have a couple of starting points, like Ruud Veenhoven, my predecessor at Erasmus University, already started with collecting all kinds of cross-national surveys and data in the World Database of Happiness, in a particular part, the State of Nations, which serves in part not only as a bibliography, but also as an archive on surveys in which estimates are stored. And then we combine it with data from this survey data recycling project from Poland, which is basically harmonized large cross-national surveys. They did that until 2017, but we also applied their methodology and extend this recycling, at least for subjective well-being, until 2023. So for the time being, we created a first version of the database, which contains 9 cross-national surveys that incorporate Europe to generate a regional panel for evaluative well-being. This is also like the cross-national happiness index of Talida, a project that is or will always be in a way under construction, in the sense that later we will add more years. So we hope to extend the database until 2026 and further. And we can add also more national surveys, I think, to it, to also sometimes get more fine-grained detail about for some countries. So in many countries, we have at the NUTS 2 level. In the Netherlands, that would probably be at the province level. But for some countries, given also data availability and the number of participants that we have per region, we only have at a higher aggregate level. In Europe, that would be the NUTS 1 level, for which we have data in the panel, and that's predominantly for the larger European countries like Germany, Italy, and France, and the United Kingdom. So the starting point is the step 1 and 2 basically of this part is we start from the microdata of the cross-national survey. So we downloaded all the microdata from 9 different surveys from the period to 2000 and 2023. So it includes World Value Survey, European Value Survey, European Social Survey, Eurobarometer, Gallup, European Quality of Life Survey, Life and Transition Survey, and Latino Barometer, which includes Spain as a country. And then we harmonize basically the measures that are available for evaluative well-being, and we use 3 types of measures that have been early identified in the World Database of Happiness. So we include measures that measure life satisfaction. So an example would be, are you satisfied with your life as a whole? Another evaluative measure would be overall happiness. So on average, how happy would you say you are? And the best worst possible life skill, so the Cantrell ladder. So these 3 types of evaluative well-being measures. So we harmonize these measures to a common 0 to 10 scale. We harmonize the regional division. So for those who have worked with regional data, NUTS classifications tend to change over time, and you need to harmonize them in a way that they also become comparable across different national surveys. And what we do then, if we have all this micro data, so where we have a person, their reported well-being on a specific score and the region in which they live, we try to like account for differences between survey questions and survey programs, while through a regression framework. And from that regression framework, basically it means we save kind of the residual, and then we aggregate and estimate comparable subjective well-being estimates for each region by year. For now, we have 208 nuts and 1 and 2 regions. That if you look at the different types of like measures that are out there and you would aggregate them to the regional level, you can of course question how, to what extent can you really do that? Do they more or less measure the same thing? If you do some technical validation on these measures that are obtained from different surveys, so you look at like from the 6 largest surveys you see here. So the European Barometer, Life Satisfaction, European Social Survey, Value Survey, Gallup World Poll. If you create like averages at the regional level, then you see that the average scores are pretty much in line. They are on average the 6.3 to 7.3. But you also see that the correlation at the regional level is typically high. So the life satisfaction measures that are obtained from different surveys that are out there generally correlate to a very high extent. So regions that score very high in the Eurobarometer score also very high on life satisfaction in the value survey, and also score very high on the Cantwell ladder and the Gallup World Poll. The lowest correlation we get is 0.74. The highest is like 0.96 between the 2 European social survey scores of overall happiness and life satisfaction. So these are like the 2 steps that we take first. But then we can say, like, yes, some scores, we argue, are less reliable because they are based on relatively few respondents. So there are some very small, like NUTS 1 or NUTS 2 regions, especially NUTS 2 regions in the data. Also, data is missing for certain years. So like most regions are surveyed in most years, but sometimes there is a gap. And to make estimates more stable, we use information from comparable regions and years. So if there are not a lot of survey responses, so if there are many survey responses, I want to say the estimate relies mainly on its own data, but if there are few responses available, the estimate we'll borrow some information from broader patterns in the data. So in surrounding regions within the same country, or surrounding years. And that produces like the influences of random fluctuations caused by small samples. How does this work? What you see here is like the first region in the sample, like Burgenland, that is in Austria. The blue line is basically the smoothed data. So after the Bayesian smooth and small area estimation, the red line you see that is the raw data or the raw estimate, and you particularly see this correction or smoothing for values in the early 2000s when the regional estimate predominantly depends on the Eurobarometer, and there are only very few respondents for Burgenland available in these years. And here you see some examples from other regions, so from Luxembourg, and this is North Holland on the right. And you see that the smoothing gets out, like is especially you find a somewhat larger gap between the smoothed and the original values in years in which there are less like observations available for these countries. Well, you see that smoothing though preserves the regional pattern. If you what you see is that if you look at one-year stability between the unsmoothed values, the correlation is 0.8. Between the smoothed, the correlation rises from point A to point 93. The average, due to smoothing, hardly barely changes. And like if you would look at the direct estimates versus the smoothed regional year estimate, you generally find a high correlation. And you see that typically what the smoothing does is getting rid of what we would call anomalies in the data, which are mostly called by very small samples for particular regions in particular years. So what we can do with this data is that there's now, and this data will be just freely available, made available in the coming days. You can check changes over time. It is possible with this data, I think, also to explain divergence in SVD in subjective well-being. So track subjective well-being within regions over time, particularly looking at long-run developments, because it's smoothing. It is particularly suited, this database, to study somewhat longer run developments, and it's like it doesn't work very well when you really want to study shorter term shocks, perhaps. But what we also can use the data for is link more to the debates that are going on in regional economics. And what the WISER project does is, for example, looking at the link between economic growth and development and subjective well-being. So look at regions where you find economic growth and where that is not accompanied by increases in subjective well-being. Also to discover the conditions under which conditions economic growth will contribute to subjective well-being. So this is on how we currently intend to use the data, but of course there are many other applications for which you can use the data. There are some things that the estimates can tell and not tell us. Sometimes there is that some region years, and it's still a limitation, but we can perhaps still update it with some national databases on subjective well-being, is that some region year estimates are based on fewer responses or missing survey years. The database also comes with a precision estimate in that sense, that allows also to account for which of these estimates are a little bit more precise than others. We recognize that the smoothing also has a trade-off. It reduces a little bit random fluctuations that happen by chance, but you may soften sudden short-term changes. So that's also why I said the dataset might be less well suited to study sudden shocks in regional systems. And what is also important to take into account, the evaluative well-being measures are strongly correlated with each other. But of course, what has been discussed in the well-being literature, they're not necessarily identical. So life satisfaction, happiness, and the Cantwell ladder capture slightly different aspects of well-being. So what do we future extend with it? So some future extensions that we still have in mind to do with this data. We don't know whether we still want to do that within the period of WISER or in the period after, but we would like to increase the coverage. So add additional countries, add additional surveys to increase also the geographic and temporal detail. It includes, amongst others, going from the NUTS 1 to NUTS 2 for several larger countries. We're also linking it to other subnational data. So for Europe, we already combined it with other subnational data available. Those predominantly involve conditions of a good life. But we also can extend it to the rest of the world. So also going for countries outside Europe to the national level, the methodology is there. And then there is still the thing of the alternative subjective measures that you can create using this methodology and this database. First natural extension would be go to happy life years. That is something, by the way, also like policymakers like to communicate in. So which would be adding life expectancy to this database, for which there are also already good regional time series available in Europe, and also to go to affective well-being and other domain satisfactions, which will be probably be more done in future research after finishing the WISER project. So we'll stop here, and I think it would be good to open the floor for
and time slot for questions. So please make sure to post your questions. I think we're going to move over now to our distinguished panel of discussants, which will have 10 minutes to discuss. I know we are running a bit behind schedule, so I would like to ask the discussant to please be prompt within the 10 minutes, and then we'll hopefully have some time for a Q&A session, a brief Q&A session afterwards. First off is Professor Arthur Grimes from the Professor of Wellbeing and Public Policy at Victoria University of Wellington, Senior Fellow at Martu Economic and Public Policy Research, and former Chair of Reserve Bank of New Zealand, joining us this evening. Thank you, Arthur. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Fred, and thanks, Talita and Martijn. It's a real delight for me to be here. I've never been to Johannesburg, but my parents were actually born and raised there and left there in the late 1940s, so this is the closest I've been. Also, thank you to both of the presenters presenting data. I love data. I love people making data available, and for the rest of us, it's a public good. As we know as economists, it should be free, it should be available, and doing these exercises is absolutely wonderful. Thank you for making them available. I'm going to first have a few comments about Talita's presentation and then a few about Martijn's. Talita, I've read through the paper, fascinating. I just had a couple of real just interesting thoughts. One is whether words mean the same to different people. I'm thinking about a word like bad, which might mean very good in African-American language, and it might mean not very good in my language. So whether words mean different things to different groups and how you might deal with that. And also cultural differences more broadly. We know, for instance, in the evaluative well-being literature that people, for instance, in countries like Japan are less likely to say that they're very, very happy because that's not seen to be the right, the most appropriate way of describing oneself. And I wonder whether you see any similar sorts of cultural differences in the in this approach, in the real-time happiness approach. A related issue, perhaps, is whether the estimated happiness from your approach is more or less volatile than the surveyed happiness. I think that would be very interesting to see. And I wondered whether you had done any correlations across countries. Clearly the UK, or clearly England and Argentina will be negatively correlated today, but I'd be interested to know whether you've looked at correlations and what drives perhaps correlations across countries. And then the final issue that I wanted to raise was, so this is real-time happiness. Who's going to use them? And wearing my old policy hat now. When I was a central banker, we wanted real-time measures of inflation, etc. Real central banks are going down this route very fast. Here I was wondering, imagine it's politicians and officials seeing what delivers real-time happiness. It's likely to be populist solutions that suddenly spark a nerve and get lots of essentially likes, similar sorts of things. And whether people who are politicians and officials who are looking at real-time happiness might be actually encouraged to follow more populist policies than they have done in the past, and whether that could lead to a long-term decline in happiness if the populists start making use of these real-time measures. So that's something I'd like you to comment on later. Martijn, with Talita, thank you so much for doing the work you've done and making it publicly available. I did have a question as to whether it was accessible at the moment. I think you said it would be there in a few days' time, so hopefully that will be right. I noticed, and I've come across this issue myself, you've got a mixture of different scales, 1 to 10, 0 to 10, they're pretty close, they're not too bad, and 1 to 4. And clearly that's very different. And I wondered whether you'd done any sensitivity testing if you left out the 1 to 4 scales and just tried to get the other ones together, whether that would make any difference, because 1 to 4 is very different and could throw things out, or maybe make things less volatile by having 1 to 4. I don't know. You discussed the importance of thinking about which of your series we use for different purposes. If we're using dynamics, we would want not to use the smoothed series, I think, if we're looking at dynamics over time. Also, I don't think you mentioned in your presentations, but you also a third series where you borrow across regions. And so again, I think if we were looking at regional correlations, we wouldn't want to use the series that borrows across regions, because that would artificially introduce some correlations there. So that's just for people to be aware of, but you deal with that in the paper. One issue about which I thought you might want to think about when you put the data up, and whether it's possible for the issue of volatility and the small numbers sometimes, is put up the number of observations for each region for each region quarter that you have. Is it quarter or year? But anyway, for each data point, have the number of observations. That way, that would allow the user to use particular weighting systems that they think is appropriate, rather than relying on your particular way of looking at that. So I'd love to see that released along with the data. So again, thank you to you both. I'm a data nerd. I love seeing data. Places like the OECD puts the PISA data up for us all to use, and we can use it. You've both done a great job. So thank you very much. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Arthur.
Thank you very much. Just a quick one. We're just jumping to our next discussant. Thank you very much, Arthur. And we would just like to introduce Professor Paul Dolan from Professor of Behavioral Science at the London School of Economics, author of Happiness by Design and of the Wellbeing Questions Used for the UK's Office for National Statistics. Paul, over to you. I know time is running out, so thank you very much for taking time.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk today. I'm so glad that Talia didn't put the English happiness up from this morning, because I can't express how painful it is after being beaten by Argentina last night, of all teams to lose to in the manner in which we did. And so I think that's really significant and important, because those effects are real. And I do think sometimes academics and policymakers are, I don't know, underestimating the significance of how people feel moment to moment in their appraisal of policies. Of course, lives go well in myriad ways, and evaluative measures give us useful insights into how people think about their lives when they reflect on them. And I wonder, if I was reporting a life satisfaction score right now, whether it would be affected by the pain that I'm experiencing from England getting beat last night. Certainly, if I was filling out a Cantrell ladder, almost certainly not. And so, whilst all of these measures, I think, provide us with useful information, I think we need to be clear about some of the category confusion that we have in these measures, because it would be my strong suggestion that particularly Cantrell ladders, to some degree life satisfaction, are actually more aligned with more of the old preference satisfaction account of welfare used in economics than the mental state account, which subjective wellbeing measures are in principle designed to tap into. So I'd just like us to be clearer about what the measures are measuring and what we reserve the word subjective wellbeing or terms for. Might sound semantic, but of course it's important, I think, for when we're thinking about using these measures to guide public policy decisions. And so I am delighted that actually there's work ongoing looking at evaluative measures on the one hand, and trying to capture experiences as people live and breathe their lives, and as England fans, are in pain after being beat by Argentina yesterday. And I've said that a few times because I think it's important, because I do think, again, sometimes policymakers and academics can be, I don't know, what's the word, a little bit elitist, a bit too cerebral. We do live and breathe and feel our lives, and we experience them, and we pay attention. That's the critical word that I use in Happiness by Design. Our lives are determined by what we pay attention to, and I do think, to some large degree, the measures that have gained prominence in the wellbeing research world are measures that we don't actually pay attention to very much when we experience our lives. I'm very rarely thinking about where my life sits on the best possible, worst possible life scale between 0 and 10. But I am experiencing pain, joy, anger, worry, stress, excitement, sadness, every single moment of every single minute that I live. And so, again, it's encouraging that we're measuring all of these things. But I would, and you might expect me to say this if anyone has read Happiness by Design of what I've written since, but that we should be paying much more attention to those direct experiential measures. I'm very pleased that the OECD, Jessica's on this call, I see, so I don't feel obliged to say this, but maybe she's prompted me definitely to remind everybody that we've just written some updated OECD guidance on measuring affect, where we recommend using measures or incorporating more on meaning, loneliness, pain. And here's an important one: joy. It's a very interesting question. I'd like actually many people to think about this. If I asked you the question, what do you do for joy? I find it really interesting question to ask policymakers and academics, because a lot of people will give, again, very kind of cerebral thing. Oh, well, I'm learning the piano, or I'm learning to. Oh, no. I'm not saying what you're doing that is meaningful and purposeful. What do you actually do for joy, purely in and of itself? And actually, a lot of people can't come up with an answer to that question, which is, I think, partly a sad indictment of the way in which we organize society, but of the way in which we live. So I want to make a case for not only affect, but actually, really, the richness of what it means to live well. And I think we can sometimes get misdirected in that by looking too closely at the evaluative measures and not closely enough at how people feel moment to moment. And that was really my main contribution that I wanted to make this morning in 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. Really appreciate it. We'll just give straight over now to Jessica as our third panelist. So Jessica Mahoney is a policy analyst at the OECD Center on Wellbeing, Inclusion, Sustainability and Equal Opportunity, and lead author of the 2025 update of the OECD guidelines on measuring subjective wellbeing, the guidelines that shape how statistical offices worldwide collect this data. Jessica, over to you. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much. And I'm assuming the sharing has gone properly.
Yes.
So thanks so much. I'm going to take a slightly different tack from Arthur and Paul and kind of how I reflect on this. So I'm a policy analyst at the OECD Center on Wellbeing, Inclusion, Sustainability and Equal Opportunity, or WISE. We're similar to WISER, but not the same. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how we think about collecting data on well-being, very much in reflection and conversation with the presentations that we saw. So the work that we do at the WISE Center and my team does is thinking about how to measure well-being, but then also how you can use those data in meaningful ways. So just very quickly to kind of, as Arthur was saying, sort of put your policy hat on, why do we even care about this in the first place? So the OECD has a long history of promoting well-being. We view subjective well-being as sort of a subcomponent of a broader multidimensional approach to measuring what matters for people, planet, and future generations. So it includes objective material conditions, but also all of the subjective assessments that people make about their lives. And the OECD's view is that these subjective measures are an important complement to traditional measures of progress. So they provide a fuller picture and a better understanding of a lot of these complex challenges that people and governments are facing, things like the digital transition or geopolitical conflict, changing climates, and so on. Just at the OECD, we see subjective well-being measures popping up in OECD policy analysis and advice. And I put a few examples here on the screen. So thinking about education policy, improving student skills in the school environment, that stream of work includes subjective well-being measures, how students feel about their lives, their socio-emotional skills, their sense of belonging in the school place, etc. Then also healthcare, improving patient outcomes. So patient-reported outcomes are used to assess healthcare in one measure. And then the third point, just to make here before going into the more specifics, at WISE, we also give policymakers guidance for next steps once you collect well-being data, what you do with it. And here are just a few high-level examples of how these data can be integrated into the policymaking process. And this can be true for subjective well-being data as well. So to encourage national statistical offices, but really any data producer, to collect data on these different well-being topics, at the OECD, we produce measurement guidelines, and this is what Paul mentioned. So we just produced an update of our guidelines on measuring subjective well-being, and Paul was involved in that, as was Connell. So this is a great panel for advertising this work. And we focus our guidelines work on areas where official data producers traditionally haven't been as active. So that is things like trust, you see here, social connections, population mental health, and then, of course, subjective well-being. So on the right here, you see our core module of 3 priority subjective well-being measures. So it includes this life satisfaction question you've seen a lot, also a question about meaning and pain, which Paul alluded to. And of course, the guidelines itself has a lot of other modules. There's a lot more information in there if you're interested. But essentially, we design them to be a useful toolkit to data producers. So if you're interested in measuring it, it's sort of ready to go. You can take this and slot it into an existing survey. We try to design it so that it can be slotted into different types of surveys, different survey modes and formats. But very much, this is designed for a traditional survey, which is what I want to kind of now segue into. So most of the subjective well-being data that you see globally as part of the global evidence base comes from a household survey. And household surveys are facing a growing number of challenges. So there have always been issues with household surveys, or not so much issues, but there are these constraints that you have to deal with as a data producer. But there's been further pressure, I would say, in recent years. Widespread digitization of communications, changing communication norms, people using call screenings, reluctance among respondents to share personal data, so the sense of trust, growth in the deployment of surveys, both public and commercial bodies, so there's more and more survey fatigue, changing survey modes, operational factors, internal resourcing constraints. So just to say, there are a lot of issues facing household surveys. So this is not unique to subjective well-being. It's true for any data that's collected in a survey, but it's something that's very front of mind now among our stakeholders and in conversations we have, is kind of how to ensure robustness of data. And we care about this very much in the subjective well-being space because so much of the data currently comes from household surveys. And if it's not coming from a household survey, as Talita made the point, these innovative methods are using the household surveys to validate and benchmark. So this is just an illustration looking at long-run decline in response rates in some household surveys. So this is for 2 UK surveys, the UK Labour Force Survey. There's been quite a lot in the news about some of those issues with response rates. Also in the US, these are just examples, but this is true kind of across the board. Again, not specific to subjective well-being, but very much relevant for subjective well-being. And then one of the concerns, of course, is that the declining response rates, it's non-random. And so we're worried about the representativeness of the people who are still participating in the surveys. Again, this is just an illustrative example from Scotland, but you can look and see here that younger adults are becoming less and less represented in these surveys, whereas older adults are becoming more and more representative. And then similarly, people from ethnic backgrounds are becoming less representative. So this is something that we need to think about. Well-targeted social policies need to have a good understanding of the actual needs of the population. So it's a concern if surveys are no longer as representative as we assume that they are. And then this is also coupled with changing survey modes. So we have some existing evidence from Paul, who we just heard from, that subjective well-being outcomes are higher if people are responding to the survey over the phone compared to in person. It's less clear, the shift to online data collection, what that means when you compare it to phone versus in-person surveys. There's some mixed findings there. But then there's also some questions about what increasing use of mixed mode surveys will mean for survey responses. And then there's newer research that's looking into how survey mode might interact with age, or maybe not so much age, but generational cohorts, which can lead to different age distribution patterns in subjective well-being. So looking at, are young people the happiest, the U-shaped curve, or are they actually the least happy? And survey mode might be playing a role in that, how they interact with survey mode. And then also this question about representativeness, depending on survey mode, if you have fewer young people, if you're using a certain type of survey mode or not. So just to say these are lots of caveats and concerns. And so these are some things in listening to Martin's presentation that I'm sort of curious when you're collating data from all of your recycling. I like that word, data recycling. Obviously, there's a lot of statistical smoothing and harmonization that is happening, but how you think about dealing with these types of issues, because that would be quite instructive, I think, to understand more. And then one final layer is just this transformational role of AI and artificial intelligence. We're seeing that there's already some national statistical offices who are producing and disseminating official statistics with AI. And obviously, in unofficial statistics, this is very much something that's happening already. So here on the left, these are some examples from the Irish and French statistical offices, some examples of how they're using AI, and it's primarily for classifying text responses, processing open-ended questions. So these examples are not specifically for subjective well-being, but I think it's very clear how you could apply this to new ways of collecting data on subjective well-being. Then on the right, this is a presentation from the IMF, but it's discussing a really important fact for any producer of data, which is that the end user is changing. So it's no longer the case that a user is navigating to your website or to your report and accessing the data themselves or looking at a table and interpreting the data. Instead, it's increasingly people who are using AI chatbots to ask a question in natural language, and then the AI is accessing the data on the back end and repackaging it and giving it to the user. So there's a question then, if that's how people are expecting to engage with statistics, how do you as the data producer ensure that your data is accessible to AI so that it's included then, but also how you can ensure that important contextual information like the metadata, et cetera, is traveling with it. So that's very front of mind right now for stats offices, is thinking about this. And it's perhaps a bit tangential, but I think related to Talita's, I'm curious. So obviously one of the issues with using big data in the way is sort of, if you have changes to the platform that you're using, you have to then pivot, which you've shown an example of doing previously using Twitter. Now you've pivoted to Google Trends. But as the way people interact with Google changes, a lot of people, and I would anticipate, it's non-random and it's also probably age-related. More people aren't Googling things; they're instead just going directly through AI chatbots. And so, what that means then for something like the work that you're doing. Before I finish, though, I just want to say I know I've perhaps been slightly critical of surveys. But surveys are very much a key resource. They are the key resource for us at the OECD. Still the first method for collecting data on subjective well-being and other data about people's perceptions and intentions. And very importantly, and Talita made this point many times, so I'm glad, they're also the benchmark for validating new tools. So it's really important, even as we attempt to innovate in this space, that we still make sure we're expending the right amount of resources to make sure surveys continue to be done in a very rigorous method, so that we have high quality data from them. But there is a question of how to make sure they're sort of cost effective and efficient, and maybe we can sort of harmonize with new ways to be, I guess, more efficient in resource allocation. And then as a last note, just to say that, despite the fact that the OECD, we spend a lot of time talking to NSOs or national statistical offices on survey data, we are doing some experimentation with different types of novel data collection methods. And Talita mentioned this paper, which is the lead author is one of my colleagues at WISE, Fabrice, which is looking at nowcasting subjective well-being using Google Trends data. So that's something that we're also doing ourselves at the OECD. So I will leave it there for the sake of time and happy to talk more after.
Thank you very much, Jessica. I'm going to jump over to the third discussant and then we can, or the fourth discussant, sorry, and then we can open the full floor for some questions. So the fourth discussant is Connell Smith, Principal Economist at Kotata Insight in Wellington, a former manager of social conditions at Statistics New Zealand, and formerly a senior economist at OECD, where he led the development of the first international guidelines on measuring subjective well-being and trust. Connell, over to you.
Thanks so much, Frederick, and thank you, just a huge thank you to both the authors of the Talita and Stephanie and the authors of the first article, and to Martijn and company for the second article. Like Arthur, I am a huge fan of data. You can't do anything without good data. Right. Hopefully that's present. Yep, being shared. Right. So going quickly through this. Data is important, and big data is particularly important. Quantity has a quality all of its own. It's a great quote, usually attributed to Napoleon or Stalin, although in fact I think if you dig, it's some mostly nameless American think tank official in the 70s who actually said it first. But it's something that should have been said by someone like Napoleon or Stalin. So when we think about how wellbeing data is used in policy, I'm going to take an actual example that was given to me by High Performance Sport New Zealand a few years back, which is how much is an Olympic gold medal worth? This segue ties very well to Talita's presentation. You go away and look at the economic literature on this, cost-benefit analysis type measures. Almost all of them use a contingent valuation model, asking you how much would you be willing to pay for country to get a gold medal. And obviously there are a bunch of limitations associated with that. Some methodological and some just cost related, right? So it's expensive to do. You go out, you get a small sample. There was this one study, which I'm about to dump all over, but in fact the authors did exactly the right thing. Humphreys, Johnson and Whitehead. They, in addition to doing contingent valuation, did a wellbeing valuation. However, their wellbeing valuation didn't work very well. It was a smallish one-off survey. So N equals 3,000, which is not too bad, but not large. And it was designed, kind of tacked on to the end of this thing. So it wasn't really rigorous. So it was missing two of the key features that both the two presentations of today have talked about. It wasn't large, and it wasn't well validated against other measures. And the result was when they got it, I don't know if you can see down there in the corner, but the values they got for a gold medal were about 10 times higher, between 10 and 1,000 times higher, 100 times higher than anyone else's. And the values they got for non-gold medals were actually negative. So it didn't work. When we went back and had a look at it using data from the New Zealand Household Economics Survey, which when pulled together, we had about 63,000 observations, so 20 times as much. And we also had high quality data. So the HES is a national survey, good response rates, good question. And the values you can see that come out of this are much more reasonable and much more in line with other things. So the key point which comes here is that the quality of the data you're working with matters, and many of the policy issues we're going to want to look at with wellbeing data are issues where noise to signal ratio is a real challenge. So to deal with that, we want big data sets. So a few comments in on both these. So the gist of that is that both these two projects, Talita, Martijn, you're doing God's work. Okay, this is the right thing to do. A few reflections on the two programs or two papers. Firstly, Talita's paper. So nowcasting, it addresses lag, the 1 to 2 year time frame. It addresses the frequency at which it can be updated, right? So you can get weekly things, and it addresses sample size. You can get a very large sample size out of it. For all of these reasons, I think that the big data approach is worth doing. A few thoughts. Firstly, the use of PANAS to shape the words that you use, the affect terms you're doing. So one of the things that came up in the project which Jessica mentioned, I was looking at non-Western, globally inclusive measures of subjective well-being. Every affect term in PANAS essentially is individually focused. I can be living alone on a desert island and I can feel happy or depressed or sad or angry or stressed. And most of the affect measures and most of the words we're working with sit there. I'd be interested, partly because I don't know the answer to this, what happens if you start using terms that relate to affect or emotion that are relational, that are purely individual? Guilt, shame, compassion, respect. So once you start thinking about these things, there's a whole lot of emotions that have a social context. I think that would be very interesting in this to explore in this sort of approach. Secondly, any nowcasting that I've seen from previous ones has a half-life once you get to out-of-sample prediction. So you model it on, you train your data on true happiness. Once you stop training it and you take that data and start predicting going forwards without updating it, over time the R-squared is likely to erode. That's not a bad thing. We expect that to happen. But for the policymaker using one of these measures, it would be really helpful to know what is the quality of the data if it hasn't been up, if your underlying model hasn't been updated for 6 months, 1 year, 18 months, 2 years? I think this is particularly for these nowcast models, that the sort of half-life of R squared on your out of sample is of really high value to the user. Finally, validation strategies. So when you designed this, you looked at true happiness over time. It would be really useful to validate it by looking at same base data, UK true happiness, but looking at the degree to which your measure reflects cross-country geographic differences. So you've got a 1-point difference in your overtime sample. The difference cross-country is actually about twice that. And since you've trained it on the time series, if it works well at a geographic level, that's a really strong validity signal. For what it's worth, the best and worst areas in the UK, true happiness, are Brighton Beach in the south and the Shetland Islands in the north. Martijn, harmonising large-scale survey data. So high frequency regional panel data has real value in testing public policy impacts. EU has potential to generate natural experiments, different national policies, but borders are porous. So high quality, updated regional data time series, hugely valuable. I'm really quite optimistic about the conceptual differences in measure not being an issue. When we did the first guidelines on trust, we got the ONS to test a few of these and split sample trials, and found the differences between, say, overall happiness and overall life satisfaction were trivial if they existed at all. 2 things to suggest. One, like Arthur, I think you want to consider looking at Eurobarometer quite hard. Mapping 4-point to 10-point is non-trivial, and I suspect that's part of the reason why your Eurobarometer average is 6.3 and all your other measures are above that. Secondly, in the Eurobarometer data, at least through to 2000, there are significant changes in question order, with sort of political questions getting dropped in right before the life satisfaction question and then taken out. And in the pre-2000 data, these unambiguously have a big effect on life satisfaction in particular years. Really good to test that. Finally, of course, 4-point scale actually has less statistical power than a 10-point scale. This is a really trivial thing. I don't know if I've ever seen anyone do it, but I'd be interested in thinking, is it worthwhile weighting observations based on this scale? Because my guess is that 1,000 0 to 10-point responses have more statistical power than 1,000 1 to 4 responses. Finally, my last point, and then we can talk. So there's already a large-scale regional data set in the EU. EU Silk, which is annual since 2021, has an annual sample size roughly twice the sample you've assembled. This doesn't mean I think assembling the sample is a bad idea for 2 reasons. One, the EU Silk sample is recent, and for policy, a 20-year time frame is fantastic. And 2, Eurostat doesn't really make this available as panel data at the moment, but it would be really interesting. The data exists to directly test the panel you've built, which is easily available, against harmonised national statistics with a similar, actually slightly larger annual sample size. And again, that would be a really good validation strategy. Okay, I'll shut up now and hand it back to the chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Connell. I really appreciate it. I would like to give now maybe a few minutes just to wrap up, to give to Talita and Martijn to maybe give some feedback based on the discussants' comments, and then I'll see if there's any questions in the chat box, and then I'll intervene to maybe give those questions. But I'd like to give the last minute or so to Talita and Martijn to provide feedback or response based on the discussants' comments. Thank you very much. Martijn or Talita, either one of you can go first. I'm not sure. Just unmute Talita. Sorry, yes. Then.
There we go. I'm unmuted.
Yes, yes.
Thank you very much to the discussants. I mean, to see these well-renowned academia and to get their comments is amazing. There were a few comments. Let me just answer them and look at them. Different cultures and how they understand the words. This is my next project, and I've already climbed into it and done some research. Very interesting. Definitely words, these type of effect words and much more on cognitive is not the same in different cultural areas. You will see more of this soon. Then correlations between the different countries. I must really tell you there have been cross correlations between the countries. What we've done is we've done a few difference in difference and event studies where we specifically look at an event and how it influenced the panel of data that we have with the different countries. And we had good results on that. Also already published papers with an external event that affects emotions. So definitely you see those shocks very clearly that you probably won't see in life satisfaction. A quick look at what else did you ask? Correlations. And the policy importance of experienced well-being. I think Paul Dallin highlighted quite a few of them. And I think Prof. Richard Layard agrees that there should be more focus on the side of experienced well-being, because it's not just the outcome, but it's also basically a leading indicator showing how people react to certain events. We just looked at something like compliance. If the people's not happy with what you say and you can see it in their mood, they're not going to comply. So that was another research we did, definitely having policy impact. I think that was it. Remind me if there's any other questions.
Okay, I think maybe we can go over to Martijn and then
Yes,
if there's any more.
And I'm lucky now because somebody is drilling next to me, so like my neighbor. So if I get disturbed in that process, then sorry for that. So many thanks for these many thoughtful comments. I'll just like briefly highlight a few. So like to start with the 1 to 4 skill. There the drilling starts again. With the 1 to 4 scale. So I agree that is the odd one out. And I think it has already been addressed in some others research. I think we start here from the survey data that has been harmonized by the recycling project in Poland, which uses like a simple linear transformation. We can indeed run a robustness check, leaving this data out, but that would also mean like dropping considerable number of observations. At the same time, we could also look at different scaling or transition that has been it's difficult to concentrate with the drilling. So there has been, like in the 2010s, particularly Ruth Veenhoven and the Dutch National Statistics, because the Netherlands also used initially the 1 to 4 scale, have been conducting some studies on how to translate this 1 to 4 scale into a 1 to 10 or a 0 to 10 scale. So it would be worthwhile to look into this literature and to see to what extent also like rescaling according to the Eurobarometer data, according to these type of measurements, would matter for our findings. The validation suggested by Connell, I think it's wonderful to test this against the national survey data that is out there to do a validation study, and also using the EU Silk would be great. With regard to Jessica's comment, yes, that's a very important point regarding representativeness. I was shocked to see on how the representative also declines and response rate decline, and in particular that it leaves some groups also like very unrepresented in survey data. That having said that, like by pooling data, I think that we try to come to more representative data for European regions. At the same time, that doesn't mean that all groups in society are equally well represented, and which also means that this data probably cannot always very well use for, like, for example, specific policy evaluation that target these specific groups that are probably vulnerable, but at the same time represented in this data. For regard to like some of the data features, it's important like to mention the data set comes indeed with also the number of observations per region year that we have. And it also comes not only with the average subjective well-being, but also with a standard deviation measure and precision indicator. So that is also what you can utilize as a user for this data. I'll stop here.